It took Reagan one call. It always takes one call. When they want to get it done, it takes one call. One call, that's all. It took one call for Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1957 after the first illegal Gazan raid, a raid into Gaza by Israel, where they occupied the Gaza Strip for about 4 months and continued to, carry out massacres. And Dwight D. Eisenhower said, we're going to sanction you. This is in the 50s, 1957. I think this was before, in fact, really the Israel-U.S. allied relationship fortified, which was 10 years later in 1967. The fact that they had to stand down in Gaza in 1957, March of 1957, if I remember correctly, because Dwight D. Eisenhower said you have to put a stop. And I think there was a diplomatic, political reason for that. It usually centers on a new president's inauguration. If you notice, that happened this year as well with Trump's inauguration and the announcement of this ceasefire that was, they were going to stop because it just doesn't look good. You got a new president coming in, and so out of respect, they give a 24-hour, pause, or they announce it and then subsequently keep doing the same thing. They just announce the ceasefire. And at the time, I made a video saying this always happens. It also happened on January 20th, 2009, I believe, for Barack Obama's inauguration. Barack Obama was able to stop the worst operation in the Gaza Strip carried out by Israel. I say operation, I mean war crime. Up until that point, in the 60-year history up until that point, or 70-year, whatever it was, Operation Cast Lead, and it was deemed by Amnesty International 22 days of death and destruction. And Barack Obama, it actually began. The initial aggression began on election day. Just rewind back to, November, I think it was 2008, right? If I remember correctly. November something, 2008. It was right there right during that time when Israel, I think they struck, they did an airstrike or they did a cross-border raid into Gaza. And that was to provoke Gazans. I think Hamas was in power, newly in power at that time. You always want to get a pretext for a full-scale invasion. So they do like a minor aggression. They do a cross-border raid, kill a couple people, and then this incites a reprisal by Hamas. They fire rockets. Israel then uses those rockets as a pretext for a full ground invasion, full-on operation, and that's indeed what happened. You had Operation Cast Lead start on December of that year, December 26th or something like that, and then there was 22 days of death and destruction, what Amnesty International called, and it only stopped when Barack Obama made a phone call. We're going back to that one phone call. That's all it takes, right? And he got him to stop. Out of respect for the inauguration. Don't ruin my big day. Anytime you have rich and powerful people telling you it's complicated, they're lying. It's not complicated. It's just that they don't see any benefit for themselves in fixing it. So it's always the same playbook, always a path to peace, a future prospect of a two-state solution. It's funny that rhetorically, our presidents of the United States of America champion the two-state solution and call for a diplomatic resolution, a path to peace. They say we got to get to a point where we can get to the two-state solution. And yet when it gets voted on by the UN and put in as a resolution, the only two states that reject the two-state solution, the two-state solution resolution, is, can you guess, the United States and Israel. A Chinese sea captain once told me when he thought we're the three worst types of people to deal with, 1 and 2 were Israelis and Indians and Taiwanese. The first two deserve each other. Yeah, there's a lot of Indians that love cosplaying as Israelis on Twitter. I've come to find they have large followings. And there's a lot of, I guess, Hindu people that don't like Muslims. And so they see the bloodletting in Gaza and they cheer on the one and only Jewish state. And any attempts to make this about religion will be rejected on this stream, okay? This is not about religion. It's about a national political movement pursuing ethnic cleansing. It has hijacked religion. It has scapegoated religion. Israel has literally been telling people for years they're keeping the Gazans on the edge. Yeah, that's true. They keep them on, what, a diet of starvation? Or how do they put it? The overall goal in Gaza was always to make life intolerable for people that live there so that they won't want to live there. They'll just get out of there. We're going to make the place scream. That's what they've said, you know, they being Israeli top level officials, like people like Ariel Sharon. That's been the policy. They are on record of like formalizing a policy of deterrence, which is a nice way of saying we're going to implement disproportionate violence as a starting point for our campaigns. Our goal is to wreak disproportionate violence, which is a violation of international law to do that. We're going to violate the principle of distinction as well. But the point of it is to terrorize, humiliate, and punish the civilian population to force a political goal. That is literally the definition of T-wordism, okay? And that's what the I state does. There was a really important document which was later recanted by the guy who wrote it, or one of the guys that wrote, the main guy. Is it Goldberg or Goldstein? Not reporter. The UN fact-finding mission, Israel, I'm going to say Goldstone report, excuse me. The Goldstone report. Here's the full text. Look at that. Look, this is something a Zionist will never show you. This was, remember we were talking about the Operation Cast Lead in 2009? It, for whatever reason, and if you were curious about all this, you can read Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom by Norman Finkelstein, who goes over this in such vivid detail. But for whatever reason, this operation, and there are so many operations, aka war crimes in Israel's history of occupying Gaza and besieging Gaza. Goldstein, I know. Well, that's the thing, is he's a Jewish Zionist. A Jewish Zionist wrote this report. He was actually he's a South African / Israeli, because they're, you know, of course they have dual citizenship. So he's an Israeli Jewish Zionist who's also South African. And he was the juror, or the maybe he was the judge that presided over South African apartheid. The case against South Africa for its apartheid. And as we all know, the apartheid was abolished, at least formally, but he was the one that said, went through the whole case and, agreed that, it was an apartheid and it should be abolished. After Operation Cast Lead, he was tapped by the UN to form a fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict. And, he seems pretty credible, right? I mean, he presided over the first apartheid ruling against South Africa, and he's a Jewish Zionist, so you can't say that he's biased against Israel. He's an avowed Zionist. He loves the state of Israel. Well, even he, and I know I'm belaboring the point and taking a while to get there, but he writes this, this group, this fact-finding mission. I mean, it's not just him. He's working with a bunch of other people on this, but they all go to Gaza. They review all the facts about everything that happened in those 22 days. And they interviewed IDF soldiers, all from both sides. Every very thorough investigation was done. And he even concluded at the end that the goal of this operation was to humiliate, punish, and terrorize the civilian population of Gaza. They were being punished because Hamas was in charge there. I wish I could find the direct quote. This is a really long report, as you can see, and it goes over so many trials. I'd really, what is better is if I just got Norman Finkelstein's book, which, when I was a little bit closer to finishing the book, I did read a little bit of it on stream. But I can't stress to you enough how great that book is in having you learn. Let's see if I can find the quote, even if we found an article. So UN, look, 15th of September, 2009. So, cast lead ended on, what did I say, January 20th, 2009? So a few months later, about 9 months later. UN fact-finding mission finds strong evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the Gaza conflict, calls for an end to impunity. The UN fact-finding mission led by Richard Goldstone, there's your guy, on Tuesday released its long-awaited report on the Gaza conflict, in which it concluded there is evidence indicating serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law that were committed by Israel during the Gaza conflict, and that Israel committed actions amounting to war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. The report also concludes there's also evidence that Palestinian armed groups committed war crimes as well. Of course, the reason that Richard Goldstone even considered the case was because he said he wanted to also look into Hamas and prosecute their war crimes as well. So the report also concludes there's also evidence that Palestinian armed groups committed war crimes as well as possibly crimes against humanity in the repeating launching of rockets and mortars into southern Israel. Of course, international law makes clear, I mean, this is the United Nations, but the international law makes clear that reprisals against an occupying force the occupying force is to blame for. 574-page report. The mission found, we're talking about 2009, okay? It's well before October 7th, 2023. The mission found that in the lead up to the Israeli military assault on Gaza, Israel imposed a blockade amounting to a collective punishment and carried out a systematic policy of progressive isolation and deprivation of the Gaza Strip. Sound familiar? During the Israeli military operation, codenamed Operation Cast Lead, houses, factories, wells, schools, hospitals, police stations, and other public buildings were destroyed. Families are still living amid the rubble of their former homes long after the attacks ended, as reconstruction has been impossible due to the continuing blockade. Sound familiar? More than 1,400 people were killed during the military operation. Significant trauma, both immediate and long-term, has been suffered by the population of Gaza. This is 2009, by the way. The report notes signs of profound depression, insomnia, and effects such as bedwetting among children, the effects on children who witnessed killings and violence, who had thought they were facing death, and who lost family members would be long-lasting, the mission found, noting in its report that some 30% of children screened at UNRWA schools suffered mental health problems. This report concludes that the Israeli military operation was directed at the people of Gaza as a whole, in furtherance of an overall and continuing policy aimed at punishing the Gaza population, and in a deliberate policy of disproportionate force aimed at the civilian population. The destruction of food supply installations, water sanitation systems, concrete factories, and residential houses was the result of a deliberate and systematic policy which has made the daily process of living and dignified living more difficult for the civilian population. The report states that Israeli acts that deprive Palestinians in the Gaza Strip of their means of subsistence, employment, and housing and water, that deny their freedom of movement and their right to leave and enter their own country, that limit their rights to access a court of law and an effective remedy, could lead a competent court to find that the crime of persecution, a crime against humanity, has been committed. So the fact-finding mission of the UN doesn't have any legal agency, I guess. These are recommendations that this commissioned report then presents to the UN and the UN delegation, but there's no prosecution. The report underlines that in most of the incidents investigated by it and described in the report, loss of life and destruction caused by Israeli forces during the military operation was a result of disrespect for the fundamental principle of distinction in international humanitarian law that requires military forces to distinguish between military targets and civilians and civilian objects at all times. That's why they can't claim negligence. You can't aim a javelin missile at a school at 3 p.m., on a busy day in downtown Gaza City, and, knowing that the javelin missile is going to burrow a crater into the earth 25 meters wide by 10 meters deep, and a blast shockwave that's felt, blocks away, hundreds of yards away. You can't claim that you didn't know that that was going to kill a lot of people and a lot of innocent people. It's within the range of foreseeable circumstances foreseeable outcomes the IDF should have known. And so, of course, they do know. And of course, the goal is to target civilians. And Norman Finkelstein brings up such a great point there, because he says, given all of this, how could you argue that they weren't intentionally trying to target civilians when that was exactly the foreseeable outcome? And that is exactly, given all these circumstances, that's exactly what happened and what they were, intending for. They say, well, we're not intentionally targeting civilians, that there's Hamas inside there. Well, the way that you're going about this leads us to believe that you are intentionally, you're doing just that. You are targeting civilians. But, we've been talking about the same shit. I mean, I've been saying the same, I feel like a broken record. I've been saying the same things, the same answers. And I'm sure I'm just getting a small dose of it, because there's people that have been devoting their entire lives, that have lived much longer. There have been over generations that have been saying the same thing. They've been trying to plead to the world community to get them to listen to the Palestinian narrative, and nobody does. So I can, and that's one thing about the gaslighting of the Israelis, that if they stick to their debunked talking points, then you're never moving the conversation forward. They're never, you always have to go back to that same point that it's an endless vicious circle, the endless feedback loop. It never gets anywhere. So I get it, get why they just, it never has to change. Anyway, I forgot, you see it spelled out there. This is an article that basically summarizes what was the summary of the actual operation in the fact-finding mission report. So there's a little bit of scandal connected to this. A lot of, Zionists, if you are to bring this up, they always have these little rebukes, and they say that, Richard Goldstone subsequently retracted the main thrust of his thesis here in the fact-finding mission report, which was that Israel was intentionally, punishing the civilian population. He actually took all that back. And it's true that he did write an op-ed in the Washington Post. He tried to get it written in the New York Times first, and they didn't accept it, because he didn't make enough admissions. So the first letter that he wrote, and we assume that he was under a lot of pressure, because this is a Zionist who then calls out Zionism. He's lambasted as a self-hating Jew by the Israelis, subsequently, as you can imagine. And they have, we know Israel has the power to materially affect these people's lives. So he was, he was threatened to a certain extent for his livelihood, for what he did. I'm not sure. I don't know the exact details of this, and I would point you to Norman Finkelstein, who talks about this, and I'm sort of trying to present this to you now. But so he changes his tune, years later, or maybe it was months, maybe it was about a year later. He writes this op-ed in New York Times. New York Times rejects it. They don't even want to share it because it doesn't really contain any new information. So he writes a second letter, and in the second letter he admits, or he changes his tune a third time and says, basically, I retract the things that I said in that report, which is weird, because, so Zionists will cling on to that and say, see, even you're talking about the Goldstone report. Oh, big deal. He even said that it was not real. Well, the actual mission, the people that carried out this mission, that found all these facts and compiled all this information, wrote all this stuff down and presented it to Richard Goldstone, they never retracted the findings of the fact-finding mission report, and they kind of called out Richard Goldstone and sort of condemned him publicly for doing that. And all that to say that it doesn't take a fact-finding mission report necessarily, because to write up an article, because there's also everything that they said in that article you can find quoted by Israeli officials regardless, because Ariel Sharon, for example, has, throughout his long, illustrious career of being a demon, has made it very well known over time in his many different positions in that government, whether it's the IDF Southern Commander, or he's the Prime Minister of the country. He's made it known that, you know, we're here to implement disproportionate violence against the civilian populations. This was expressed by Gadi Eisenkot, who was same position. I think he was the IDF Southern Commander or the Northern Commander. I forget which one. Probably the North, because the Dahaya Doctrine originates in Lebanon. Their wars with Lebanon, and how they basically leveled an entire neighborhood in the Beirut suburb of Dahaya, or Dahia, I'm not sure how you say it, and that became the metaphor that they're going to use, that they're going to implement in other territories and other wars that they decide to start. But the goal is always to show the rest of the Middle East that Israel cannot be with. Israel is crazy. They want you to think they're crazy because they don't want you with them, because they're deeply insecure about their existence. You're an Israeli, you are in an existential crisis every day of your life. That much is clear. Whether it's fleeing from one Houthi missile to the next, into one shelter to the next, having to defend your culture, in quotation, online, or whether, you know, when you go abroad and you have to tell people you're Israeli, the scoffs that you're going to get. So they have to show the rest of the Middle East that they are not to be with. They will literally your entire family. Since October 7th, they've started wars. I mean, they've attacked, you know, aggressively attacked like something like 7 countries. So yeah, I mean, all these officials, whether they're in the IDF top levels or they're in the Knesset, wherever. I see so many comments like this is what you get for attacking a lion first. I know they love to think that they're lions. I mean, look, guys, just because you put a lion emoji and an Israeli flag next to it doesn't mean you're a lion. Doesn't mean Israel is a lion. The goal is damage, not accuracy. I mean, I'd never heard that one before, but that is exactly what the IDF does. Same with Benny Morris. Norm also condemned Morris for denying the history of Israel, even though his previous stance was correct and accurate. Yeah, he did have you're absolutely right. Benny Morris is a turncoat. He was, and I don't even know if that's an apropos label, because I know that he wrote one book where he condemned Israel, but I don't know if that means that he's anti-Zionist, even that withstanding, you know? And these comments are under starving babies and wounded children. Yeah, they have no shame. They literally have no shame. But I still try my best